Hello. Tonight I want to talk about the numbers. I want to have a go at trying to get a feel for maybe what some of the losses, the numbers of men that have been killed in this conflict might be. This is obviously a morbid topic, but it's something which gets discussed so much in social media with wild claims that one side is doing wildly better than the other for this reason and that reason. So I've had a bit of a think about some of the indicators out there and wanted to try to step through some of the information to see if we might at least be able to find a ballpark region, or at least be able to see if logically we could convince ourselves that one side might be suffering more KIA, more men lost than the other side. So obviously we can't believe at face value what we hear directly from either side. The numbers that are estimated by the Ukrainians of Russian losses are massive numbers, and numbers that you pick up in Telegram channels by Russians estimating Ukrainian losses are always, again, massive numbers. And it's very difficult for someone on the enemy side to really be able to estimate what numbers of losses are. Yes, you can use technology like satellites, and you can look at population demographics, and you can make estimates, and you can see the number of vehicles and time spent training. And yeah, these are things that you can do, that you can estimate. But real numbers of losses really comes down to the side who has lost those people, who can best estimate that. And neither side generally wants to admit what their losses might be. Earlier on in the war, we got some figures from the Russian Ministry of Defense, where there was a number of about 5,000 admitted at one stage. And I'll go into that in a little bit. But I think there's a couple of data points that we can draw upon, that we can look at and see if we can build a picture, maybe like a scatter graph of data around an area, and try to come to, I'm going to try to come to what could be a figure for losses on one side, and then look at other factors to see if we could then, from that, get an indication of what we think might be happening to the other side. So I'll start here. I'll start with some information that was received from the Pentagon leaks, which were a couple of months ago, some leaks of information allegedly leaked via one junior serviceman, but a lot of discussion that perhaps these were actually leaked via someone higher up who wanted to get some of this information out because they felt it wasn't being covered in the media. But in the Pentagon leaks, it's indicated that the Russian FSBs, they reported a loss or a total casualties. This is in February 2023. They were mentioning casualties of 110,000. Now, these numbers here, casualties, are a mixture of killed and wounded. People have been taken out of the fighting. At the same time, the US were estimating the Russian casualties at between 190 and 225,000. So almost twice what the FSB were saying. Now, the FSB, we don't quite know how exactly what they were counting in their numbers. If they were counting things like casualties from the Wagner Group, from PMCs, from Storm Z, from some of the volunteer battalions, from the Chechen groups, or from the Donetsk territorial forces in Donetsk and Luhansk. We're not exactly sure, but in either case, the numbers the Americans are estimating is twice what the FSB are indicating. So perhaps somewhere in the middle. If we do take the American estimated numbers, they estimated the losses between 190 and 225,000 casualties, and here we get a data point we can start to use, with an estimate of 35 to 43,000 killed in action. So the lower figure being 35,000, the higher figure being 43,000, out of a casualty range of 190 to 225,000. Taking those KIA numbers, doing a little bit of high school math, as a rough percentage, that's around about 18%. So of the total estimated casualties, the KIA is around about 18%. Okay. So one data point I mentioned earlier that we had in September last year, that was the Russians indicated that their deaths of their servicemen then were 5,937 confirmed by the Russian Ministry of Defense in September of 2022. Now, the Pentagon leaks indicate that this was around February 2023, the numbers that they're talking about there, with those 110,000 casualties estimated by the FSB and 190 to 225, with between 35 and 43,000 KIA estimated by the American figures, by the Americans. So we have in September perhaps a number. Now, again, these numbers, I'm not suggesting you have to believe them or that they are accurate, but let's just start somewhere. So let's just say in September of 2022, we had 5,937 confirmed Russian killed servicemen. If we take the 18%, which we calculated from the 35,000 US estimated KIA numbers out of the 190,000 total casualties till that period of time, if we apply that 18% to the FSB estimate of 110,000 casualties, we end up with a number of 19,800 in February 2023. So that's something. We've got two data points now. Now again, these will not be accurate, of course, but we've got something we can start to work with. So September last year, we had 6,000, let's say. And then in February, we've got possibly 20,000. So, a lot of things were certainly, the battle was heating up in areas, from October of last year, with Bakhmut, really from that region. The fighting became very intense during that period of time, right through until sort of February. So you could expect that there would be, some sizable increases. But again, let's not concern ourselves too much with the exact number here. But we've seen growth over a period of time, which you would expect. And that 20,000, if we get that 20,000 number there, it's less. It's about half of what the Americans are estimating the number might be at 35 to 43. It's nearly 20,000. The American estimate sits around the 40,000 mark. Okay. We've got another data point that we can draw on here. So the BBC, or the BBC satellite arm in Russia, and a group, a media outlet called Mediazona, have, while this conflict has been running, have been attempting to confirm the number of killed in action Russian servicemen. And so they've been working on things like open source means. So they've been looking at scanning Russian newspapers for obituaries, looking at church services, documents that are provided, messages from families, grave data, things they can publicly get their hands on. This information isn't being released by the Ministry of Defense, but this is information that they can, in the same way that I'm grabbing data points, they're grabbing data points of information to try to confirm numbers. So I guess effectively they're able to perhaps confirm, getting close to at least a minimum. We might say a baseline. These numbers that they have confirmed appear to be numbers of servicemen who have died. Now, the number surely will be higher than that. There'll be ones that they've missed, that they've not been made aware of, they just haven't been reported. Some of these people who have died may have had no family, no one's written an obituary for them or organised a funeral service, whatever it might be. And obviously some of these some of these poor men will still be on the battlefield, and it won't be known that they are dead back in Russia necessarily yet. So anyhow, so just this week, the BBC and Mediazona have been doing this throughout the conflict, but this week they have released their updated numbers, and their June 16th confirmed numbers, which again we consider as a perhaps a baseline, a minimum number, is 25,500 KIA. So of that, they give some detail, which is that of the 25,500, 2,150 were officers, and 161 of those men were pilots. So clearly gives an indication of that. There's been a number of Russian aircraft and helicopters clearly destroyed if 161 pilots are confirmed. Now, that number that they give, the 25,500, again, if we can put that now, maybe make that our third data point. So we had September last year, a report from the Ministry of Defense of Russia that there were 5,937, nearly 6,000 confirmed deaths. And then if we take the Pentagon leaks, take the FSB number, multiply it by 18%, we get a number from February of around 19,800, nearly 20,000. And now we have the BBC and Mediazona in June confirming a baseline lower number of 25,500. So I feel like we could start to talk about these numbers. Again, not being precise and accurate, but perhaps not orders of magnitude away. It's not as though we've seen a figure initially of 5,000 and then suddenly both the FSB and the Americans are estimating, oh no, the number of KIA only 4 months later is not 20,000 or 40,000, it's 200,000, it's 400,000. We're not seeing that sort of divergence. And I'm no statistician, but at least the numbers seem to be coalescing, and if we plotted them on a graph, they would seem to be increasing as you would expect. We also haven't seen something weird like that where we have 6,000 and then we get 20,000 using the BBC and Mediazona numbers, using the Pentagon leaks numbers, and then suddenly Mediazona say, oh no, it's only 4,000. We're not seeing that. So the data isn't indicating gross abnormalities. And I wouldn't want to bet my house on this, but I think for the benefit of this discussion, we can take those three data points: September about 6,000, February about 20,000, June about 25,000, going up, heading the right way. Sadly, some of the analysis done by Mediazona indicated that junior soldiers die in far higher rates than the more experienced and senior soldiers, which is to be expected. You would imagine that senior, more experienced people have a feel for battle, perhaps are in more elevated positions and may not necessarily be as directly active on the front line. The new guys might get sent out to go and do do activities that see them become exposed more so than the older, more experienced ones. But again, it's a terrible feature of war. Young men suffer and die in large numbers. So again, we've got some numbers there for perhaps Russian KIA going the right way. And again, the number that we see from the Mediazona and BBC, which is the British Broadcasting Commission, it's an arm of the BBC. While we're not exactly clear on what numbers are being counted in all areas, I think we have got we're in an order of an area here, so that you could even, if you wanted to, you could double it if you wanted to. Say instead of 25k, say the BBC have missed a whole heap, and it's 50k. We could say that now, thus far, the Russians have lost 50,000 men dead, killed in the special military operation until now, in just over a year. of fighting. So I don't mind what you choose, 25k, 50k, but I don't think you could confidently go beyond that and start saying, look, we're at 100k, and be able to use this data or any other data that I've seen thus far to be able to justify saying 100k. I'd say 50k, maybe we're up at the upper limit there. If I was having a conversation about this with some mates at the pub, going through this logic, yeah, I'd gift them, I'd say 50k, maybe 50k, maybe 25, certainly no less than 25. There's 25,000 confirmed. So double it. Let's go to 50k. Okay, so now I want to turn this conversation a little bit into the second half of things, and maybe try to then look at what Ukrainian losses in terms of killed servicemen might be. Now, we don't get anywhere near the same numbers from the Ukrainians. I mean, I haven't found a source where there is a group like the BBC. Please, if there is, someone put it in the comments, because I'm just not aware of it. If there is, I can go back and redo these numbers. I can do another video on this, and we can maybe try and get even closer. But I'm not aware of some other group that's doing that for Ukrainian forces, who's going out and actively seeking to confirm the numbers that have been killed in action. We also don't get numbers from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And again, any numbers that we did get from them, I would imagine would be wildly reduced compared to what they actually are. So we don't have the same ability to get those first couple of data points like we have for the Russian numbers. And look, completely honestly, I understand. You could say, oh, but you're accepting the FSB number of 110,000 that was in the Pentagon leaks. Yeah, you're right, I am. But I'm okay in this game of pin the tail on a donkey to choose the number game that we're playing here to do that. First of all, if this is leaked information, then perhaps that was real, accurate information that wasn't meant to be exposed, but that was leaked out. And the other reason is the Americans have got their estimate in there as well. They say the 190 to 225,000 casualties and 35 to 43,000 KIA. If this is an American document, well, they're probably going to be estimating on the high side, just out of natural biases. So maybe we could suggest that the number might be lower than that or around that. But yeah, again, even if I take that number, yeah, it still puts us, the doubling of that 20,000, it puts it up to 40,000. Still gets us around, what I'll gift you at 50,000 as KIA. For the Ukrainians, I need to do something else here. I need to take a different approach. And I'm sure that some people won't like this approach. And of course, this is by no means accurate. But I want to talk through some topics here and see if we can then arrive at a point together where we can say, okay, we hadn't assumed Russian number, and based upon some other factors, where do we think the Ukrainian number might sit in comparison to the Russian number? Do we think it might be a smaller number than the Russian number for these reasons? Do we think it might be about the same? Or do we think it might be a larger number for these reasons? So if you've got nothing else to do, if you're in the car, if you're going to sleep and you're listening to this this podcast, wherever this is for some reason, then here we go. And I'm going to start with the one that's going to get the most noise from people. But let's just think about perhaps the quality of the forces of the two armies at war here. So we've got the Ukrainian armed forces, and we've got the Russian armed forces. Both of them have been, to some extent, involved in this conflict from 2014 onwards. There's been fighting in the Donbass region. So there's on a far smaller scale, of course. But so some of the Ukrainian forces have had experience in fighting in that area. Some of the Russian forces have. Russian forces have had broad experience for many years. There's been involved in fighting in Syria, different conditions, but still lots of experience. Lots of experience with tactics and strategy and that of warfare. So we're thinking about sort of quality of forces here, and again, this is going to vary over time. You know, the quality of forces of the say the Ukrainians may have been very high, you know, strong forces at the start of the offensive, but perhaps inexperienced. Because perhaps a lot of those newly increased numbers just hadn't had an opportunity to fight anywhere and had no experience. Similar thing sort of applies for the Russians through the mobilization the Russians have gone through. But we do know that at least recently in the Ukrainian offensive, that there are these 9 new NATO trained brigades, and we've seen how some of them, you know, the poor 47th Brigade, how they've fared in the first couple of weeks of this offensive. This if we're looking at quality of forces, then one thing here, you know, I've heard people. I think this might have been the retired General Ben Hodges from the US, saying that he saw this as an advantage, that these are NATO trained forces on NATO equipment. But I heard some other people come back with a very good point, which was the NATO equipment is unfamiliar. It's not the Soviet era equipment that most of the Ukrainians are used to operating on. And that learning new equipment isn't an easy process. This isn't like picking up an American rifle, and when you're used to a Russian rifle. This is detailed control systems, detailed procedures and SOPs and communication between different technical specific roles to coordinate the locating and direction finding and firing and targeting of rocket systems and missiles. You know, the coordination of a tank, multi-million-dollar piece of technical equipment in which people train for years to become proficient. And here we have an example of 9 new battalions of Ukrainian forces, many of them trained now on NATO equipment. Now, this NATO equipment, yes, very good equipment, but it's new to them. So their level of experience there, I don't think you can say would be as high as the equivalent brigades relatively newly formed in the Russian mobilization, who are operating on the Soviet and Russian equipment that all of their training will have been based upon. We know that in the Russian mobilization, that many of the people who have come up in that mobilization, which is touted to be upwards of 300,000, many of them were existing reservists who've already had military training in Russia on Russian equipment, and they're now moving into the battle. But there are some questions like, where are the Russian troops that have been mobilized? Now there's some commentary online about this, suggesting that the reason that we're not seeing them all yet is because the Russians have enough of them to be holding them back, and that they are using them and they are rotating them in and getting them some general experience at the front line and rotating some of the front lines out. So while you might not be necessarily seeing whole battalions being rotated out, which would normally be an indication of rotation, what the Russians might be doing is a more of a trickle feed rotation. Send in a few fresh green recruits to the front line, send out a few of the worn ones, let them have some time at the back. Becomes difficult then for the Ukrainians and the Americans to determine that you're actually doing your troop rotation, because they're not seeing a whole battalion, everyone with this insignia, those tanks they've been looking at through the sniper rifles for the last 3 months, suddenly pulling out and being replaced by new ones. So The quality of the forces, if I had to toss a coin, I would feel that the Russian forces probably have the upper hand here. Generally, maybe not by a great deal, but again, if I had to toss a coin, flip it, heads or tails, heads, I would say the Russians probably have the upper hand there. So then, if we just going to continue on this list of things, and when we get to the end of this, we can maybe then work out where we think the Ukrainian numbers might sit. So air superiority. In the last couple of months, there's been very little evidence of the Russian Air Force incurring losses of aircraft. But I have seen a number of reports, regular reports of a Ukrainian jet being shot down. Reports from about 2 weeks ago of a number, I think it was 4 or 5, maybe Su-24s destroyed on the ground. These were planes which were being kitted out to be able to launch the Storm Shadows. Apologies for those of you who are watching. I don't know, my camera's freaking out. It doesn't like me tonight. There we go. It's focused again. So losses on the ground of a number of planes, and there have been throughout the entire conflict many reports of Ukrainian air losses, and even in reporting coming out in the last couple of weeks from both Ukrainian and Russian troops via Telegram and social media, there's very little indication of much Ukrainian Air Force activity near the front line. Yet we have reports of Ka-52, the Russian Alligator attack helicopters, working over columns of Ukrainian armor in the last couple of weeks. We have reports, and have had these for the last number of months through Bakhmut, of the FAB bombs being dropped. So there's a lot of reporting of Russian Air Force working along the front line. Very little reporting of them losing aircraft, and the other way around, not much reporting of Ukrainian air activity near the front line. So again, air superiority, I would say, based on what I've seen, particularly in the last 6 weeks or so, I would say that it's probably the Russians. Now, we know the Russians have got well over 1,000 aircraft in their stockpile and their supplies. The Ukrainians aren't replenishing their lost supplies in large numbers, or if they are, through NATO nations gifting them aircraft, then they don't seem to be using them in large numbers, which I'll come to why that might be just in a moment. But for air superiority, again, I would say at this stage it feels like it's the Russians that have the upper hand there. So then if we move on to missile strikes. Now, for the last few months, there have been, if not daily, almost every other day, reports of missile strikes from Russia into Ukrainian locations and targets, targeting everything from ammunition dumps to command headquarters for brigades, marshalling areas for equipment and troops, rail line interchanges, infrastructure staging areas, power generation and the power network, and particularly of late in the last 2 months or so, air defense systems, including the video of what seemed to be very convincingly show the destruction of a Patriot missile system. I've talked a little bit about that before. Simplicius the Thinker has a great article on that, where he shows before and after photos, the video of the the Patriot missiles going out, and then the response coming back in, the explosions in that area, and then the subsequent admission by the Pentagon that yes, a Patriot system was damaged on that night. So the missile strikes which the Russians have been launching consistently is not being matched or returned by the Ukrainians. If it was, we would hear about it all the time. And a great example of that is all the noise happening today because of the couple of Storm Shadow missiles who got through past Melitopol and made it down towards the bridges that connect Crimea to Ukraine. So we're not seeing the Ukrainians inflicting the same sort of missile-based damage on the Russian supply lines, command centers behind the lines, infrastructure and rail lines that the Russians are using. So I think clearly missile strikes in that comparison, that the Ukrainians are at a disadvantage to the Russians. Okay, so getting to what I mentioned before, air defense. If we consider air defense, now the Russian S-400s, the S-350s, the S-300s, the Soviet era equipment is good. Western media will say it's not as good as the Patriot missile systems, but if you look at the history of why the Russians developed these and why they needed to develop these, which was because in conflicts with the West and with the United States, it's been assumed that the United States would have air superiority. And so the Russians have not tried to outpace the Americans in that regard. Instead, they've focused their years of effort and intelligence and ingenuity into air defense systems. So again, while the Russians are capable of producing more S-400s, S-350s, the S-350s just a fortnight ago reportedly had their first fully autonomous AI successful strike against Ukrainian jets. So these are advanced air defense systems. Now the Ukrainians clearly have been losing their air defense systems over time. We can see that because there have been Patriot systems bought in to protect Kiev. The Ukrainians will struggle to replace any S-400s that they may have had or S-300s that they may have had from Soviet era, and will be now dependent on Western air defense systems, which of course are good, but probably haven't got the same peerage and ancestry as the S-400s and the Russian air defense systems do. Also, we have had more reports when the Russian Ministry of Defense is talking about its missile attacks on what actual Ukrainian air defense systems as targets. So moving away from strikes to power generation and power networks, but focusing now on air defense systems, putting pressure on Kiev to draw air defense back from the front line in order to protect the capital. So air defense is another area where, based upon the information I've been able to garner, my guess would be that the Russians hold the upper hand, both in terms of the air defense systems they have at their disposal, the experience they have operating them, but also in terms of husbanding and maintaining and keeping those high quality systems operational. I think the Russians are in a better position to be able to do that than the Ukrainians are at this stage. So that's air defense. So then let's just move on to artillery. Now, I think it's widely accepted that the Russians in this conflict have more artillery pieces available to them to use. I think Western media, Ukrainian media admit that in terms of the ability to fire shells in this conflict, that the Russians have a larger ability to do that. And there are reports that corroborate this coming out from Ukraine in areas like Bakhmut, when the fighting was going on there over the last couple of months, that something like 80% of the casualties that are occurring due to artillery. So this war is an artillery war, as John Mearsheimer says. Artillery is king. So Russia has, in this fight, more artillery pieces and is shelling at a higher rate, a higher frequency. So while the Ukrainians might be capable of launching 1,000 shells a day, the Russians are routinely firing 6,000-7,000 shells a day. And there were reports earlier from in the fighting when they were getting up at some days up to a number of 20,000 shells a day, which are massive, massive numbers. Now, while the Russians are indicating that they're not having shell supply issues. I mean, if you ignore Evgeny Prigozhin, I mean he is a character. I would love to know what his alleged conversation with Putin was a week or so ago, where Prigozhin reportedly left the meeting in good spirits, and it was considered to be a good meeting between him and Putin. I would love to know what is going on there. Anyhow, Prigozhin, who has claimed many times that the Russian military is running out of shells because Wagner's not getting enough shells, there are some perhaps mitigating factors to that. One being that Prigozhin has a dispute with Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, because Shoigu is allegedly the head of Storm Z, which is a competing private military company to Prigozhin's Wagner group. Also, another perhaps factor that plays into that was that there is talk that the strategy of the Ministry of Defense, Shoigu, around Bakhmut was to keep Bakhmut as a trap. Don't close the pincers. Keep it so the Ukrainian forces could come in, so that the Russians could continue to just using artillery, superior artillery, trick the Ukrainian forces. Whereas Prigozhin, his troops are in there. If they're not getting as many shells as he wants to be able to perhaps advance and claim victory of Bakhmut and take Bakhmut and be able to declare a win for Wagner, you can see the competing goals between what the Russian Ministry of Defense might have wanted to achieve in Bakhmut, use it as a trap, keep it going for as long as we can, versus Wagner, or Prigozhin, wanting to say, well, I don't want to be seen as not being successful here. I want to take Bakhmut, raise the flag with the Wagner flag, and be seen as being successful. So putting that aside, it's the West that is having trouble with ammunition shells, with both supplying them to Ukraine and with the ability to produce them. I just want to read a little piece here from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. So he warned on Monday that Ukraine is using up ammunition far faster than its allies can provide it. So the numbers today of 1,000 shells a day, or whatever it might be, that the Ukrainians are consuming, is higher now than what the Western NATO nations can provide to the Ukraine. Pardon me. He goes on to say, and is putting pressure on Western defense industries, just as Russia ramps up its military offensive. So now this isn't coming from Russian media. This is from Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, saying that Ukraine is using ammunition at a faster rate, which is a rate lower than what Russia is currently using it by a factor of 6 or 7. And it's putting pressure on the ability for the Western defense industries to be able to produce it. He then goes on and tells us, the war in Ukraine is consuming an enormous amount of munitions and depleting Allied stockpiles, Stoltenberg said. The current rate of Ukraine's ammunition expenditure is many times higher than our current rate of production. This puts our defence industries under strain. So this is very, very important admission. This isn't Stoltenberg saying, oh, we've had some issues with getting supplies to the Ukrainians and that'll be sorted out next month. No, he's saying here that the Ukraine conflict is depleting Allied stockpiles, not depleting the Ukrainian stockpiles, but depleting the stockpiles of ammunition that the NATO nations have. There were reports a couple of months ago of South Korea providing 500,000 of its shells to America, but certainly via America to Ukraine. So this impact is not just impacting Ukraine's stockpiles, but impacting the stockpiles of the NATO nations, of Germany, of Poland, of Romania. And he then says, and the expenditure is many times higher than our current rate of production. Now, producing ammunition isn't something that you can just flick a switch and suddenly double or triple your production capacity, particularly in Western nations that aren't directly involved in this conflict. You can imagine it would be a challenge to go to let's say the British or the German or the American governments and say, we need to increase our shell production by a factor of 10 or 15 immediately, and we need billions, if not trillions of dollars of investment to make that happen yesterday. That's not going to fly at the moment because, remember, America's not in this war. Britain's not in this war. While this is clearly a proxy war, they can claim arms distance they're not involved. And so for this reason, the West is going to struggle to increase its production. I'll just go on with a little more of what Stoltenberg says about this, and then I'll come back to those production problems. He says, according to some estimates, Ukraine is firing up to, oh, well, here you go. I was saying this is Russian numbers, so perhaps the Russian numbers are higher than this. But in some estimates, Ukraine is firing up to 6,000 to 7,000 artillery shells each day. Around a third of the daily amount that Russia is using almost 1 year into the war. Okay, so let's take these figures then. I was wrong, and the figures, Ukraine's firing 6,000 to 7,000 shells a day, and Russia's using 3 times that, 18 to 20,000 shells a day. Now, I think these figures may be figures from a while ago. I think things have maybe slowed down a little since then. It's been a while, I think, since Russia was perhaps peaking at 20,000 shells per day. But still, this is from Jens Stoltenberg, so it's not Russian propaganda saying that that Russia is using 3 times as many as the Ukrainians are. Finally, he goes on to say, that speaking, this was just this week at the NATO defence ministers meeting, he said the waiting time for the supply of large caliber ammunition has increased from 12 to 28 months. Now, this is primarily the 155 millimeter ammunition. So large caliber ammunition has increased the waiting line for the supply of this from 12 to 28 months, and that orders placed today would only be delivered in 2.5 years' time. So an order placed today for 1 million shells for Ukraine will turn up in the start of 2026, 2.5 years away. So clearly this is a problem for a war of attrition where artillery is king and where, by the West's own admission, the Russians are able to send 3 times as much artillery back as the Ukrainians can send. Now, let's just go a little further. So in comparison, and this is from the Washington Post, reports from the Washington Post indicate that Russian shell production is at the rate of 2.3 million per year, or 200,000 per month, up from 140,000 per month last year, and that reports for production is planned for further increases. Now, I've seen a number of articles indicating that the Russian ammunition production is well underway to increasing, so that they already have a significant head start on the West, and so that while the West may increase its production numbers in a year's time, in that year's time, Russia is likely to have produced its production numbers by even more. So that's the artillery. So that's the artillery side of things. So I think there it would be very difficult to claim that the Ukrainians have a benefit in terms of artillery and the ability to rain down explosives on Russia. So a couple other points here that I'd just like to cover off, and then we'll get near the end of this talk for tonight. The escalating weapon requests. So we've seen in the conflict the Ukrainian side asking and receiving increasing numbers of weapons. I mean, the US have provided already over $130 billion of aid. There was an announcement last week of another 325, tiny figure really, $325 million aid package. And just this week, the Pentagon has confirmed that their accountants made an error, and by incorrectly using the replacement value for the material, tanks, weapons, Patriot systems, whatever it might be, that have been given to the Ukraine, instead of the book value, they've actually found another $6.2 billion that they can now give to Ukraine as aid. So combine that with what the UK and the EU has provided. Look, I'm roughly going to take a stab at $0.2 trillion has been provided. $200 billion has been provided. I think it might have been the UN, I read yesterday, has committed to providing another $50 billion over the next 4 years. So there's certainly weapons going to Ukraine. We've seen, started off with Stingers, anti-tank missiles, M777s arriving, the big American artillery pieces, Patriot air defense systems, Bradleys, Leopards from the Germans, Storm Shadow long-range missiles from the Brits, Challenger tanks from the Brits. More than likely, if not already, very shortly, ATACMS long-range missiles. We know that F-16s are planned to be on the way, and there's talk of there is talk now of NATO forces even moving into Ukraine. NATO has been talking about increasing their ready response force from 40,000 troops to 300,000 troops, and positioning those troops on the eastern border of the NATO countries. And military analysis, who I follow on YouTube, he's got a very good channel. Yes, he has some thoughts that perhaps some of the troop movements going on at the moment, where Ukraine are moving battalions down from the Belarusian border into Kupiansk region and down into Donetsk and Zaporozhye, that they wouldn't be doing that unless they were certain that the Russians and Belarusians wouldn't be advancing down from there, which would be difficult for them to be certain of, or B, that they felt that there might be replacements coming. And so he was suggesting that with the NATO summit in July, it's a couple of weeks away, the talk from the likes of ex-Danish Prime Minister Rasmussen, who has been trying to coordinate security guarantees from some of the NATO states without the wider NATO introducing Ukraine into NATO, but by having some of those states form their own mini security guarantees, which would allow them to bring their troops into Ukraine, not under the NATO banner, under Ukrainian banner, but nevertheless be NATO troops with NATO equipment. So we see these escalating weapon requests and requests for support. A question: if Ukraine were dominating, being successful, grinding away at the Russians, would we see this constant request for escalation and more weapons, or would we expect to see the Russians doing this? Would we expect to see the Russians introducing more of their most advanced fighters, perhaps? Would we be expecting to see the Russians, indications coming out that they were seen to be seeking China for assistance with things? It feels, it feels to me like maybe the Ukrainians are asking for more because they need more. Maybe they're not progressing as fast as they were hoping in this offensive. So, okay, moving on from that, then just even looking at the recent offensive and the recent attacks by the Ukrainians, we've seen a lot of video footage of Ukrainians losing some of their most modern equipment. The Russians have now called an area of the frontline fighting Bradley Park due to the number of Bradleys that were destroyed there. We've seen a number of Leopard tanks destroyed now. In the Russian Ministry of Defense daily briefings, there is almost daily 1 or 2 M777s that we hear of being destroyed. Plenty of video evidence of them being destroyed. So, we look at the new brigades that were trained by NATO, and the 47th in particular, who've taken a terrible toll in terms of men and machines. The use by the Russians in the last couple of weeks of their flamethrower systems, the TOS-1 tank-mounted multiple rocket launch systems which are capable of firing the thermobaric warheads. The effect that they have, the use of the FAB family of heavy bombs, the 500 kilogram, 1,000 kilogram, 1,500 kilogram guided bombs, which are being used by the Russians. The ability of the Russians to counteract the recent attacks and advances with this sort of firepower, with the flamethrowers and their thermobaric capabilities being so effective against entrenched areas, are we seeing what we would expect in terms of Ukrainian success in this offensive? General Petraeus, their retired American general, he spoke just before the offensive started, and he gave the indication that the expected strategy would be, yes, they would go in with heavy columns and they would break through, and in 72 to 96 hours they would have busted their way down towards Melitopol, down towards the Sea of Azov, and then be followed through by a large reserve force. So he gave the indication, retired American US general, that we would have seen rapid advancements, and that was the plan. And we haven't seen that. So I'll come back to that a little more in just a moment. But one thing just to cover off before getting near the end of this now, and I'll get to the point of how we might want to do some sort of a comparison. But the thing which we hear very often, this old rule of thumb the 3-to-1 attacker to defender one. Now, this is often claimed by people that, oh, if you're attacking, you will definitely lose 3-to-1. That's not what this actually says in terms of military doctrine. It suggests that in order to overpower a defensive opponent, you want to have 3 times as many forces to guarantee that you will overpower them. This gets turned into, misconstrued as, oh, you will lose 1 defender for every 3 defenders. That's right, 3 attackers. But that's not it. There's many, many, many examples of where this is just not the case. Think of things like, everyone mentions it, America in Iraq. The American attackers there lost just about nobody. The defenders were slaughtered. So this rule of thumb doesn't really hold. But I wanted to mention it in here because I think a lot of people would say, well, if the Russians are attacking, and they have been for ages, then they would have been losing so many more. Yes, perhaps, but there's been a lot of back and forth in this conflict. So there has been a lot of time where the Ukrainians have been attacking. So even if you do want to use that 3-to-1 rule of thumb and claim that the attacker is losing 3 times as many, then you need to also apply that when the Ukrainians are attacking. And at the moment, the Ukrainians are attacking. So if you were, I'm not saying you would, but if you were to apply that rule now, then you would be suggesting that the Ukrainians would be losing 3-to-1. I don't believe this rule's correct, but I wanted to cover it off. Now, so then finally, just coming back to my earlier point, where after initially being coy about admitting that the offensive had even commenced, just this week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has admitted that the progress of the counteroffensive was slower than desired, but that Kyiv would not be pressured into speeding it up. So here we have the admission here that the offensive hasn't gone as planned. It hasn't gone as quickly as was desired or expected or planned for. So if we just circle back now to where we started, and we thought that, okay, if we accept that the Russians may have a KIA, killed in action, a number of servicemen, and I feel bad talking about this like KIA and numbers. These are people who have died, and in some cases in horrible, terrible, and many of them deaths. But this is a war. I'm talking about war topics. So if we accept one of these numbers, either 25,000, based upon what the BBC had calculated, or if you even want to double that to 50,000, so that the Russian forces have suffered 50,000 servicemen killed in the conflict so far. And then if we also accept that Russian air defense, military strike capability, number of artillery pieces and ammunition, their familiarity with weapon systems, and the lack of molestation of their supply lines are all in Russia's favour and are in better shape than the Ukrainian equivalents, then if we assume that also it is at least likely that the Russian quality of forces, due both to experience on their equipment, experience in Syria and other areas fighting, experience with the Soviet equipment that they're using, the familiarity with that, and the freshness of those Russian troops. As I said, the reports of the mobilization bringing up to 300,000 new troops, many of them already reservists with previous experience, and reports of up to 10,000 volunteers a day in Russia now. This is in stark contrast to the announcement in Ukraine of a full mobilization in Ukraine. Full mobilisation across the country. Anyone of fighting age should report now. Whether or not you've received a form, you should report now and become mobilised. Whereas Russia, they're not currently under an official mobilisation. They did perform one back in September, got 300,000 troops, and now they appear to be getting 10,000 volunteers a week. Now, take those numbers with the skepticism that they deserve, but again, it's stark contrast between what we're hearing and seeing from Ukraine. So if we accept those things, air defense, missile strikes, artillery, familiarity with weapon systems, and supply lines being unmolested for the Russians because the Ukrainians aren't delivering the same missile strikes behind the lines. And if we consider the compounding effect of those things on the ability or the outcome of a battle, and the casualty rates. If you think of the example of like someone who's become sick, someone's got the flu. Now, a person who's got the flu, they sit down, they rest, they're okay. Their chances of recovery is good. But if they've got the flu, and for some reason it's winter and they're trapped outside in the rain at night, and they've got no heating. Oh, and what's worse, they've got no food. They haven't eaten for 2 days. And while they've been outside, maybe they're lost in the wilderness with the flu, they've managed to cut themselves. They've got abrasions all over them, which are starting to become infected. Those small compounding effects, any one of them on its own would be manageable, but together, it puts them into a very bad position, and the impacts of the other factors have a larger effect on them. So, considering all of this, would it be fair then to assume that the Ukrainian KIA, the numbers of Ukrainian servicemen killed in action in this conflict, would be higher, perhaps far higher than the Russian numbers, whatever you take those Russian numbers to be, 25,000, 50,000. I'd like to know what people think. If you watch this, please, particularly if you disagree, I would love to know why. I'd love to challenge the logic I've got here. If you've got sources that challenge it, please let me know. I would love to challenge this and be able to come back and say, you know what, I got something wrong here. We need to think of this in a different way, because if we can do that, then we can all together we can improve our understanding and our perception of what is going on here, and help us make better decisions, help us have better conversations about this. But it's as a final point, and going back to that general mobilization that's just kicked off in Ukraine, I do hope that that we don't see increasing numbers of losses for the Ukrainians and for the Russians, but for the Ukrainians suffering under these disadvantages, because they will continue to lose the young men of their country. All right, that's a very long-winded story to get to here, but thank you if you've watched it this far. Please subscribe if you haven't. If you're enjoying this channel, please tell your friends, like this and share it. That will help me keep the interest up and produce more of these episodes for you.